this. I've got a few slides, so I hope you can all see the slides. I'll just go through these, and I would anticipate I'll talk for somewhere between around 25 to 30 minutes. I've got quite a lot of detail on the slides, but I will be talking to these, so you might want to kind of have a look at the slides and listen at the same time and see how that kind of goes. The issue I want to explore with you all this evening is ever so kind of topical, and in fact is something which is being updated, and there are developments literally every hour or two. And the issue is around the implications of the pandemic of COVID-19 on prisons. And prisons in particular, I want to focus on in terms of England and Wales. And I want to do that from a socialist and ethical standpoint. But one of the key messages I want to get across is the problematic nature of the prison more broadly. And hence the title of this is "The Enemy is Not Just the Virus." When we're looking at issues around COVID-19 and prisons from a socialist perspective, we have to recognize that the prison itself is also a problem. And I'll come back to that as I come to the conclusion of this talk. Where I want to start is, if this slide will work, is with some of the kind of broader socialist ethics and principles which effectively provide the framework of what I'm going to be talking about, and the framework in terms of the critique of the current prison situation, and of course how we can best respond to the COVID-19 crisis. What effectively I'm going to be arguing from in terms of principles is the importance of having the least possible form of coercion and interventions. The notions, as would be broadly found in socialist ethics, around meeting human need, but also about the importance of respecting the inherent dignity of all people, whoever they may be, and the promotion of what the great Argentinian socialist ethical thinker Enrique Dussel calls the paradigm of life. That is, that in terms of the way that our society is organized, the way in which we try and deal with the difficulties that arise in a given society should be guided by the aims of protecting and promoting human life and well-being, and above all, the right to life. So these broader kind of notions and principles of having an intervention, not just in terms of how to respond to COVID-19, but more broadly to difficulties and troubles and problems that face us in the everyday world, should be, I think, promoting conditions of existence that promote human life and do not prevent human life, and do not ultimately violate the inherent human dignity, nor kind of result in conditions of inhuman and degrading treatment. This means that we should be looking for interventions which are as least restrictive and authoritarian and coercive as possible. And we should only be implementing responses at a state level, as we'll come to in a moment, which are at absolute minimum and are the least possible coercive option available to us. So it's these ideas around reducing the interventions to the least coercion possible, promoting human dignity, and promoting above all the right to life, which are the principles which effectively are underscoring my discussion of COVID-19 and the prison. Now, I just want to give a little bit of contextual information here, because these points will actually come back and be really, really relevant as we go through the rest of the discussion. The first thing is that COVID-19 does have some incredible kind of deadly kind of consequences for humans. and that somewhere in the region of around about 6% of people who contract COVID-19 or the coronavirus are critically ill. Now, this is largely people with underlying health problems, but not, of course, exclusively so. Now, these points are important because when we start to think about the prison population, a large number of prisoners do have underlying health problems. A second point, which is important, is that the spread of the coronavirus and COVID-19 spreads more widely in places which are unhygienic and haven't been properly cleaned. This is also something else to keep in mind as we go through and discuss the problems of COVID-19 within the prison. Not only the kind of health problems, but also the lack of cleanliness. And thirdly, and this is actually really, really important for thinking about how we actually contain and deal with COVID-19, is the fact that a large amount of people will have either very mild symptoms or be asymptomatic, i.e. that they don't show any kind of symptoms of the coronavirus. And it's estimated that somewhere between about 20 to 30% of people who have the coronavirus will not show any kind of symptoms. Now, these three elements around kind of underlying health problems, lack of cleanliness, and the impossibility without massive widespread COVID-19 tests of actually assessing who does and who doesn't have the coronavirus are very, very important for thinking about how we deal with this in terms of the prison context. Let me just give you now just a little bit of information about where we're at in terms of the prison situation as of really this afternoon. Now, there are about 83,500 people in prisons in England and Wales as of now. As we'll see in a moment, that number may go down, but perhaps not quite as dramatically as what we've been led to believe in terms of the media in recent days. We also know that in the prisons, the COVID-19 and the coronavirus has started to take hold. We know that as of this afternoon, 107 prisoners across 38 different prisons and 19 staff across 12 different prisons have tested positive to COVID-19. Now, in a penal estate of around 120 prisons, you can see that it's already, and we're still in the very early stages of the transmission of COVID-19, already approximately a third of the prison estate has actually got a COVID-19 problem. We also know that it's proved to be deadly. 10 prisoners have died after contracting the coronavirus, 3 in HMP Littlehay, and also across a number of other prisons, including in Birmingham, Manchester, Outcourse, Liverpool, Belmarsh in London, Watton, Sudbury, and also in Low Newton. 9 of the prisoners have been men, and the person who died in Low Newton was a woman prisoner. We also know that as of the 4th of April, 2 members of staff at HMP Pentonville have died as a result of COVID-19. Alongside this, and again, thinking about some of the problems I mentioned just in the top end of this slide regarding how we actually assess COVID-19 and its extent, certainly within the prisons, but also more broadly in society. There's somewhere in the region of 1,200 prisoners self-isolating and 200 prisoners who are off work, sick, or are self-isolating. Now, these elements are kind of indicating that we are starting to see the development of a very, very big problem of COVID-19 within the prisons within England and Wales, and also, of course, elsewhere in the UK and in Europe and around the world. But more broadly than that, we are starting to think through how we can avert a potential humanitarian disaster. Because as you'll see as I go through this discussion, there is massive concern that prisons could prove to be both a conduit for the disease for wider society, but also places of mass death in terms of the actual implications of COVID-19. A lot of this is still conjecture. We don't know because none of us can predict the future. But there are many, many people all around the world who are incredibly concerned about the way in which the spread of contagious diseases like COVID-19 could have a devastating effect on prison populations. Now, the government, the UK government has started to bring in certain kind of policies and developments, and they're slightly different in Scotland and Northern Ireland, where there's been a slightly more emphasis on releasing prisoners. But I want to focus here on issues around England and Wales. Now, we've had in recent week or so announcements that we're going to release somewhere in the region of 69 women prisoners, those who are in mother and baby units, which are basically where the mother and the child are together within the prison. So that is also including 34 children within that, because they've got 34 babies, and 35 pregnant women prisoners, because there's awareness that actually people who are pregnant, women who are pregnant, have a higher potential risk with regards to COVID-19. But what we also saw just about 3 days ago was that the government is planning to release up to 4,000 prisoners over the next 4 to 5 weeks. Now, this sounds like the government is listening. It sounds like there is something going on where we're actually getting a bit of progress here in terms of moving forward with this potential humanitarian disaster cutting across the penal estate. But there's actually something gone quite fundamentally wrong with this given policy already. And this is because the government, when it's been trying to kind of operate on these notions of who should be released, has been working on 2 key principles. Not those socialist principles of dignity and the right to life, but alternative principles of risk and vulnerability. Clearly, we can see the notion of vulnerability when it comes to the release of women prisoners. But with a broader release of male prisoners and this potential of up to 4,000 prisoners, basically it's been based on risk. Now, the risk element is risk of reoffending. And what the Prisoner Governors Association only yesterday have basically pointed out is that it's very, very unlikely, given the very strong restrictions on risk of future offending, that 4,000 people will actually be released. They actually believe that because of the restrictions based on the policy, there will be around 2,000 prisoners released. So even this headline figure, which is by no means enough, by the way, and I'll come back to some alternative elements of this later, will actually not be met, or is unlikely to be met, given the current focus on risk. Alongside this risk and vulnerability, we have a number of other policies which are currently being operated within prisons. Again, these are also potentially hugely problematic. First of all, we have prison lockdowns, where prisoners in many prisons around the country are being held in their cells for 23 hours and 45 minutes every day. They're getting 15 minutes out of the cell. Now, you think about that for 1 day, for 2 days, for a week. You then think about that kind of level of restriction, the frustration that that's going to generate within the kind of prison populations, to be restricted to 15 minutes out of their cells every single day. And I'll talk about some of the factors which actually make even that a difficult kind of scenario. But alongside this, the government and the Ministry of Justice has put forward the notion of shielding prisoners, which they've identified 2,000 prisoners who they believe are in that earlier category I mentioned of having underlying health problems and therefore require shielding. Now, of course, shielding is also something that's happening with 1.5 million people in the wider community. But in the prison context, this is potentially, for up to a 12-week kind of scenario, very, very restrictive. Going back to my earlier point about problems of coercion and trying to find the least coercive kind of policy, the notions of shielding and lockdown are actually quite coercive. They actually are quite restrictive in terms of people's movement. And we potentially should be thinking immediately of alternative ways of actually responding to the problem, which are less coercive, as I would argue from a socialist ethical kind of point of view. Then you have also the notion of cohorting prisoners. And I want to come back to this and when we look at the American example in a moment. But cohorting is basically bringing people who appear to have the infection together and placing them in the same wing and sometimes even within the same prison cells. Now we know that at the very least at HMP Wandsworth in London, cohorting has happened and that 50 prisoners who have some kind of symptoms of illness, they haven't been tested for COVID-19, they just simply have some kind of symptoms in terms of breathing issues, a cough, or something which indicates they may, or a fever, that they may actually have COVID-19. So we're bringing together, and this was actually the 31st of March, this was released by The Guardian, we're bringing together prisoners, some of who have COVID-19 and some who don't. Now that is the greatest way to actually ensure that those people are definitely going to have COVID-19 at the end. Now cohorting, we know is really difficult because it does actually increase the risk of multiple exposure. And we know from the death of health workers all around the world that there seems to be something about COVID-19 where the increased exposure of a number of different people who have the coronavirus seems to lead to an increase in death. Cohorting is not just a coercive policy, it's also incredibly dangerous. And according to Richard Coker, who is an epidemiologist and one of the leading experts on the transmission of diseases within prisons and other forms of detention, believes that the current policy is also unlikely to be successful. Indeed, Coker, in a number of different kind of documents that he's put together, both in terms of immigration detention and also in terms of prisons, has described forms of detention like the prison as epidemiological pumps. That is, that they are basically generating and increasing the spread of COVID-19 and the coronavirus. Let me just read you this kind of this kind of short statement, the short paragraph from Richard Coker in one of his evidences documents that he's put together. The risk of exposure of COVID-19 to prisoners and staff when new cases enter a prison is far, far greater than the risk to individuals in the wider community. Social distancing and personal infection control measures are, because of their nature, almost impossible in overcrowding settings with sanitation limitations. Overcrowding, unsanitary conditions, poor ventilation in a prison will likely increase the speed with which an epidemic unfolds, even if the numbers of cases cumulatively remain unchanged. Poor access to healthcare facilities, slow procedures to diagnose, isolate, and treat patients or quarantine contacts further reduces the time to peak incidence. The point is that it's likely that the prisons will reach peaks in terms of the kind of level and extent of the disease that would not necessarily be dealt with in the terms of the context of the wider community. And let's just look at the evidence of this. Let's actually look at what's actually happened in some of the prisons. Now, I've chosen here for us to focus on the New York prison of Rikers Island prison in New York for two reasons. One, because it perfectly illustrates the rate of infection and the rise of infection within prisons, which is going so much quicker than anywhere else. So if we look at this, which is dated on the 3rd of April, so it's only 4 days ago when this data was kind of generated, we can see that in Rikers Jail, there's on the 3rd of April, there was 54.5 infections per 1,000 people. The second highest in the world at that date was New York City, which is 6.48 per 1,000 people. Let's just look at that for 1 second. Rikers Island is somewhere in the regions of 9 times more likely to result in infections than anywhere else in the entire world. And let's look at something else on this, which is really, really important. What policy underscores Rikers Island? It's the policy of cohorting, the same policy that we're trying in Wandsworth and elsewhere. This is almost a warning to us, a warning to the fact that if Rikers Island, as one particular example, what's going to happen in the prisons of England and Wales? Now, what we do know is that there's one prisoner has died at Rikers Island thus far, and that prisoner was among 100 people who the New York Legal Aid Society are trying to get released because of their vulnerabilities. They were already successful a few weeks ago in terms of releasing people who hadn't been sentenced from Rikers Island. They won a case where 106 prisoners were released towards the end of March. But right now, there's a massive legal struggle going on, just trying to get people out because prisons are seen as places which are profoundly dangerous to the health of prisoners. Now, let's just go back to some of those earlier points that are raised about why prisons seem to be particularly susceptible to COVID-19. One of the reasons I mentioned was about the asymptomatic nature of the virus itself, in which when you have people going in and out, unless you have appropriate testing, you don't know who's actually bringing the disease into a given set of environments. The second point was the spread of the disease. And the spread of the disease was spelt by people who were coughing and spluttering over others and therefore spreading the disease by cough droplets, but also in terms of the infection being within and spread more quickly within environments which were unclean and unhealthy. Now, I just want to draw upon some evidence here which indicate that, that prisons are particularly susceptible to the spread of the disease through both of these, both in terms of individuals coming in terms of prison officers and so on, but also in terms of, in the first instance, in terms of the spread of the disease through unhygienic practices. So there's been various reports in recent times about this. The National Audit Office, which is the NAO 2020 on the slide, the National Audit Office reported only a few months ago that they found that prisons across the penal estate were rat infested and in an overall poor state of repair. Other reports have backed this up from the National Audit Office, in particular those from what's known as Her Majesty's Chief Inspectors of Prisons, or the HMCIP. Now, the HMCIP is a national body that goes around and inspects all prisons every few years within England and Wales. Now, they found that prisons continue to have all sorts of kind of difficulties, whether it be places like HMP Pentonville, which have, for example, poor state of repair, including kind of even the cell windows, which kind of are broken, and so on and so forth, right the way down to this notion that at the bottom of the slide here, that in 2019 and 2020, the HMCIP found that somewhere in the region of 35 prisons had failed infection control compliance and cleanliness, and that around 40% of prisons were deemed as insufficiently safe. So prisons are dirty, they're rat infested, and other forms of cockroaches and so on and so forth, and they have real problems elsewhere. If we look just, for example, at the kind of situation around sanitary and also size. Now, the IMB, which is cited a couple of times on this page, is the Independent Monitoring Board. Now, every prison has an independent monitoring board made up of a few local volunteers, but they also have an annual report. And this data is from the IMB, Independent Monitoring Board's annual report from June 2019. So it's less than a year old. What did they find? They found prison cells were cramped, not too dissimilar to the size of a bathroom, which is worthwhile kind of putting in the context. If we even think about what it'd be like locking yourself, not in your house in terms of self-isolation, but locking yourself in the bathroom. And prisons like HMP Pentonville and HMP Nottingham don't even meet the basic international standards for the size of cells. And that's partly because prisons like HMP Pentonville were first opened in the 1840s. You also have prisons such as HMP Coldingley and HMP Lunarton, where about half of the prisoners are in cells without toilets. And just this afternoon, there was a report in The Guardian that HMP Coldingley had a major problem with their kind of internal sanitation system, and that what you had was prisoners who were left to defecate and urinate in plastic bags. This is right now, this is just in this last week, in the context of the COVID-19 crisis, where we're talking about the problems of the spread of a disease in unhygienic conditions. And we have Eric Allison and others reporting to us just right now that the toilets are malfunctioned at this prison in Coldingley, and basically we have a situation where people are left to kind of innovate in terms of how they defecate. It's not alone in terms of these kind of problems. HMP Exeter, according to the Independent Monitoring Board in 2019 report, noted that some of the toilets failed, and this led to seepages of urine and excrement into prisoner cells. So people are not just kind of having the problem of sanitation outside the cell, but the toilets within the cells are also profoundly or potentially profoundly dangerous. Just one further piece of evidence. This from the HMCI Her Majesty's Chief Inspector report on HMP Birmingham, which was published in August 2018. And let me just read what an official government body describes HMP prison wings being like. Communal areas in most wings were filthy. Rubbish had accumulated and had not been removed. There were widespread problems with insects, including cockroaches, as well as rats and other vermin. We saw evidence of bodily fluids left unattended, including blood and vomit. I saw a shower area where there was blood-stained clothing and a pool of blood that apparently had been there for 2 days, next to numerous rat droppings. Many cells were cramped, poorly equipped, and had damaged flooring or plasterwork. Most toilets were poorly screened. Many were leaking, and we saw cells with exposed electric. This is something that myself and Joe Sim cited in a recent article in the New Socialist, and I'll put the link at the bottom of that page. And also, if you're interested, Joe Sim is speaking on National Prison Radio tomorrow afternoon, which is basically the radio station for prisoners all around the country. And Joe will be talking further about some of these issues regarding the problems of imprisonment and the COVID crisis. But let me just take this a little bit further and give you a little bit more detail, a little bit more about why these kind of policies of shielding and cohorting are doomed to fail. And this is the kind of almost frustration of where we are right now. There is not just one person or even a handful of people or even just people in certain countries which are indicating that prisons are a potential disaster for this in terms of the spread of the disease. We have people like Richard Coker, who indicates that 60% of the prison population, which is somewhere between 45,000 and 50,000 people, could actually be infected with COVID-19. Now, he estimated from data in China at the start of the COVID-19 crisis there a few months ago, the rate of death is as high as 2.3%. That is really worrying. If you're talking about 2.3% of 45,000 to 50,000 people, that is a lot of people who could potentially die within the prison situation. Further, we talked about this notion of shielding and the 2,000 prisoners that the government itself has said would be really, really at high risk of kind of having a kind of serious illness and being part of that 6% of the serious illness if they were actually to contract COVID-19. The problem we have immediately is that not all underlying health problems are identified by the prison service, so the number is much bigger than 2,000. We are not just looking at 2,000 vulnerable prisoners, we're looking at more. The number, of course, is unspecified. We also have this issue I mentioned earlier about lockdown. Prisoners being locked in their cells for 23.5 hours a day, no longer allowed kind of access to other human beings in terms of their family through visits. But that isn't necessarily going to solve the problem either. Because if there is some relaxation of restrictions, they're not necessarily going to be able to meet the requirements of social distancing for some of the reasons that were mentioned in the Independent Monitoring Board and the Majesty's Chief Inspector of Prisons that I cited earlier, but also this notion of the fact that cells and recreational and outdoor areas are shared. So people, when they go outside for that 15 minutes, this is the kind of irony right now, they're going into an environment which is shared with other prisoners who come from isolation. And ultimately, that could lead to the spread of the disease. It only needs people to touch door handles and other kind of elements in terms of other aspects, physical objects within the kind of prison space that could actually lead to that. We know that prisons have poor hygiene standards. They also have very, very poor cleaning regimes. They don't have professional cleaners come in. You have prisoners who themselves are given as their job the role of cleaning a wing. The physical and spatial restrictions mean that there will be the touching of physical objects and the handling of various different forms of kind of goods and services and the physical limitations of security also mean it's even harder for people to not be kind of be engaged within very, very small physical spaces. Just to take the example of HMP Stocken, which from the Her Majesty's Chief Inspector report there in 2019. And they noted in 2019, the prisoners were preparing breakfast packs that did not follow the requirements of wearing protective smocks. So if all you need is one prisoner with COVID-19 dealing with the breakfast in the prison or a given prison, and you could have a mass spread. Prisons are really, really poorly suited for actually kind of engaging with and dealing with these kind of responses. So this takes us to, and I'll kind of finish in the next 5 minutes or so. I've slightly overrun here, but I've only got just a couple of more slides to kind of get through. So prisons are really, really kind of damaging and really, really worrisome in terms of the current COVID-19 context, because there seems to be almost incontrovertible and enormous evidence that prisons are going to be what Richard Coker calls epidemiological pumps, that they're going to be institutions which are going to have very large spreads and very quick spreads in terms of COVID-19. And we've seen the Rikers Island example in New York City, the most infected place on the planet, as an example of what Richard Coker was trying to bring out. But let's not forget that even if COVID-19 wasn't here, even if there wasn't a kind of a situation of this potential large numbers of deaths and spread of illness and suffering and disease within the prisons, that wouldn't mean that prisons were still legitimate and defendable. Even if prison conditions were not as appalling as what we actually have right now, and there's been evidence I've mentioned before in terms of the Independent Monitoring Board, the National Audit Office, various different Guardian reports, and also Majesty's Chief Inspector of the Prisons. Even if we didn't have that evidence, we still would have a problem, because I started by saying that some of the basic social principles that I was looking to were the right to life and the notion of human dignity and respecting inherent human dignity and doing so in as least a coercive environment as possible. Prisons do not meet that criteria, irrespective of the COVID-19 outbreak. Prisons do not meet human dignity. They violate human dignity. Prisons do not lead to the respect of others. They lead to the disrespect. They don't lead to the generation of life. They actually lead to the generation of death. And they are profoundly coercive and pain-inflicting institutions. They result in what I can only describe as categorical dehumanization. By being labeled as a prisoner in its own right is to make a negative moral judgment, to indicate that that person is somebody who is lesser, somebody who can be easily morally excluded, somebody who can be seen as beyond our own sense of shared humanity. And that's one reason we have such a problem in terms of highlighting the issues that I've mentioned earlier. Because could you imagine if we had this evidence and we were looking elsewhere, that we would have such a reluctance on the part of government to act? Because that's exactly what they're doing. They're using this construction, this categorical dehumanization of prisoners to ultimately put the blockages on what seems to be the only sensible and humane thing, which is to release thousands of prisoners to avoid a catastrophic and terrible kind of level or potential level of death within the prison place over the coming months and year. But prisons are more than that. Prisons also undermine health and life expectancy more broadly. And we can look to a small number of studies that actually do indicate this and evidence this. Now, it's really hard to identify the way in which prisons generate or undermine kind of life expectancy, because people are generally released from prisons and they often come from impoverished social backgrounds and have to deal with things like poverty and other forms of social disrespect, which actually also have, as people like Marmot and Richard Wilkinson and people like Claire Bamborough have indicated, reduce people's life. So we know that people who grow up in poor areas have a shorter life expectancy, and we also know that people who grow up in poor areas are much more likely to be in prison. One study which kind of helps us to focus on the prison side of this is Barnett and others' longitudinal study of child prisoners. And the reason why that was the case was because it was possible to look at the long-term implications of being in prison as a child in terms of how that person's health deteriorated. It's very, very hard to do it because you can't separate a person out and say this bit of their life is from when they grew up in the Gorbals and when they were poor, and this bit is their life when they were imprisoned in a horrible and terrible prison regime. But Barnett and others do indicate that actually child prisoners have much greater health problems in later life than children who were not in prison, which gives us a bit further evidence that actually prisons are undermining health and life expectancy. Plus, we also know that prisons are profoundly stressful and toxic environments which undermine the immune system. They make people more vulnerable to ill health. That notion that we have this kind of situation where there are only a small number, say 2,000 according to government estimates, of people who are vulnerable to the COVID-19 in terms of it being potentially deadly, negates the fact that all prisoners are vulnerable in the sense that they have experienced, often for a number of years, of highly stressful and damaging institution, which could actually be leading to them kind of having a weakened immune system. Prisons, through notions of monotony, boredom, deprivations, unmet need, and the very dragging of time, what we call time consciousness, these ultimately lead to all sorts of interpersonal health problems. But beyond that notion of health, we have another index to indicate just how harmful and damaging prisons are to human beings. And we do this by looking at the index around self-harm, suicidal ideation, and self-inflicted deaths. According to official data released earlier this year, a reported incident of self-harm happens every 8 minutes in prisons in England and Wales. That is a reported incident, that somebody is cutting themselves, inserting objects into their body, is attempting to do other things which are profoundly damaging and leading to self-injury, are being reported and recorded every 8 minutes. And it's also a large number of people attempting to take their own lives in prison. So to assume that without the context of COVID-19, that prisons are somehow safe and healthy institutions is actually completely wrong. They are actually institutions which are really, really damaging. So let's just look at some of the data from Inquest, which is the leading organisation looking at deaths in custody. And this is some of the data looking at deaths in England and Wales in the last 10 years. If we leave aside the 2020 data for 1 month, because this is only covering about the first 10 weeks of the year, although you can see already there's still a large number of deaths. If we look down, we can see that in recent times, there's been as many deaths in prison as 354, which is one person dying in prison every single day. This is without the coronavirus. This is an institution that is doing this to people without the added complexity and danger of a virus, which all the experts, or nearly all the experts around the world, and all the kind of prison reform and other organisations which have an interest in terms of penal issues are saying is likely to be in a penological pump, which is likely to create even greater deaths. But we already see that we've had enormous numbers of people taking their own lives or dying otherwise. In 2016, for example, we had the record number of self-inflicted deaths in prison, where 124 people took their own lives. But if you look at the other data, you can see that we have, again, largely around 70 to 90 people taking their own lives. If we were to go back before 2010, we would also see that there are numbers of people who are taking their own lives each year in the 90s. It hasn't just gone up from 2010. 2010 and 2011, 2012 are relatively low numbers in the recent couple of decades. But we have 200 to 300 people dying in prison anyway. The worry is, with already 10 prisoners who've died because of the COVID-19, and 38 prisons which seem to have already got the COVID-19 kind of deeply embedded and within the kind of prisons themselves, the fear is that these numbers could be dwarfed by the 2020 and 2021 figures. We could even have a situation where we have higher numbers of deaths than in 2016. It's a real kind of concern. And this is in the context of the suspension at the moment of inquests. There will not be appropriate scrutiny of people who are dying right now to know how they died. These figures will be very difficult to assess in certain ways and categorize. You can already see that there's a number of awaiting classification in the last couple of years. And what that means is that they've been neither defined as self-inflicted or non-self-inflicted. We just know that that number of people have died. They're still working through a backlog. What is it going to be like in the context of COVID-19? So, and this is the final slide you'll be pleased to hear. So I just want to kind of give you some ideas of where we can go from here, because I've given you a horror story. I've given you a real life horror story in terms of what's happening within our prisons more broadly, what's happening within our prisons right now as we speak. And those issues are around about people locked up for 23.75 hours a day, which could, of course, result in people kicking off and there being prison disturbances of the like, which maybe we haven't seen since the early 1990s. I've already seen situations in places like Italy where, because of the restrictions and the lockdowns, we've had people who've kind of engaged in disturbances and large number of prisoners who died as a result of kind of actually, in the Italian context, has taken a drug overdose when they broke out the prison's cells and actually got into the medical room and then overdosed on pharmaceutical drugs. But we have all sorts of kind of issues which are happening here, which kind of indicate there's something very wrong with our prison policy in the context of COVID-19. But also, I would argue, from a socialist perspective, something very wrong with our prison policy per se. Because I meant at the start to say that a legitimate response would be one which respected human dignity, which respected the paradigm of life, and ultimately was as least coercive as it could possibly be. Now, the cohorting strategy, the shielding strategy, and the lockdowning strategy are not the most minimalistic approach that could be taken in terms of the current COVID-19 crisis. We have alternatives. We have a non-coercive alternative to those three particular approaches, which the government is determined to do because it's absolutely petrified of anybody criticising them, because somebody might get released and then go on to break the law once they've been released. That's the kind of issue of risk. They want to be almost 100% certain that anybody released early is not going to reoffend. We have a context of prison situation where somewhere between 50 to 70%, depending on the age category, 70% for children, 50% for adults, who reoffend within release of prison within a certain period of time, within a year. And actually that number increases if you look at over a 5-year kind of period and beyond that. The risk approach is going to be too restrictive. And this is exactly what the Prisoner Governors Association is saying, that you are not going to have a sensible policy, even of the 4,000 release, which is a very modest release. That's not going to actually work because so many people are not going to be released because of the very rigid risk and vulnerability criteria the government is using in terms of its approach to release. It is not looking at dignity and life. It is not looking at how we can actually prevent the disaster which potentially could face our prisons in the future months. The most appropriate response, the least coercive, the least intrusive, the least restrictive, and by far the least dehumanizing response is ultimately to radically reduce the prison population. We have the Prison Governors Association coming out just in the last few days, saying that if we really want to make a difference in terms of the COVID-19 spread, we need to release somewhere between 15 to 20,000 currently serving prisoners. As I mentioned earlier, as we speak, there are approximately 83,500 people in prison. That would mean reducing the prison population to around about 60,000 people. And this is an absolute, total imperative if we want to stop what's going on in terms of the spread of COVID-19. If we don't want a Rikers Island in Wandsworth, or in Manchester, or in Birmingham, or in Nottingham, or in Caldingley, or in Stocking, if we want to have a situation where ultimately we're not facing this humanitarian disaster, we need to ultimately be looking to radically reduce the prison population by somewhere in the region of not 2,000 prisoners, but 10 times that, at 20,000 serving prisoners. But the virus is not the only enemy. The virus is not the only thing that we need to worry about. We need to be focused on the kind of things that damage and present existential dangers to human life and undermine and violate human dignity. This includes the prison. This includes what happens within the prison more broadly on a daily basis. But we need to situate this within notions around discrimination, state corporate harms, poverty, and other things which are really, really damaging to us as a society. And to remember that if we want to actually get past some of these great enemies that we face, we need socially just and socialist inspired policies. We need to actually be recognizing that the only way we're going to get our way out of this kind of mess is by having those basic ethical socialist principles around human life and the promotion of human life and the recognition of human dignity, and having those as our guiding frames for how we actually are going to deal with and solve some of the social problems. We need policies around housing, education, welfare support, and we need that immediately, because it's no good just releasing 20,000 people and letting them starve to death on the street, or putting them in a situation where they're going to be facing kind of additional challenges outside in the community. So we need to have a situation that when we look to reduce the prison population, which arguably is an absolute and total must in terms of effectively responding to the COVID-19 humanitarian crisis that we face within the prison system and elsewhere, we need to have the social policies which actually mean that they can have safety and their well-being and their dignity and life can be protected in the community more broadly. On that note, I think I'll bring this to a close, because my final point was just going to be about that sense that actually prisons, they present an actual a challenge and a threat to us as human beings more broadly, that prisons may also be considered as the enemy of the people. They're institutions which generate death, suffering, and violence. And we need to be looking at responding to when people do wrong through ways and means which are less coercive and restore the kind of problems and difficulties that kind of have been generated through a given crime or problematic or troublesome conduct, and ultimately privilege human life and human dignity.
Thank you very much for that, David. really enlightening, I think, especially even seeing, you know, just how bad conditions in prisons are, regardless of the coronavirus. So thank you very much for speaking to us tonight. What I'd like to do is I'd like to open it up for any questions and comments that anybody may have about the presentation that David just made. And if anybody wants to speak, you can do one of three things really. You can just let me know in the chat box that you want to speak. You can raise your hand, or you can also just, if you're on video, just give us a wave. So would anybody like to come in with any questions or comments? Dan, yep, sorry, 1 second. Let me just put you on. Okay, Dan, go ahead.
Hi. Yeah, thank you, David, for that talk. It was really, really interesting. Loads of questions sort of come up, which are probably a whole other topic in themselves, but I'd be really interested to sort of read a bit more about the alternatives to punitive punishment and how we can take a socialist sort of approach to things. But you mentioned about one of the, given sort of the where we are at the minute with prisons in the state that they are, one of the kind of policies for dealing with this crisis would be some sort of large-scale release of prisoners. And you talked really interesting about the things that need to go alongside that, like welfare and housing and so on. But I just wondered what you thought about that risk element of people offending, and whether that is an issue, and if it is an issue, how that could be approached.
Cheers, Dan. David, you happy to answer that one?
Yeah, thank you very much, Dan. I think, well, you've highlighted a number of kind of issues there, which are really, really important. And, you know, at some later point, I'm happy to kind of talk about alternatives to the prison, because they are absolutely kind of crucial to any kind of debate, because people generally don't jump off a sinking ship unless they've got something to jump onto. You know, so people like to have the kind of the notion that there is actually an appropriate kind of thing to be done, and there are so many alternatives. I could spend literally another hour just telling you I won't do that, just to kind of put you through the punishment of prisons, but I could spend a long time talking to you about the kind of alternatives, because there are many, many, many which are actually proven to be much more effective than the prison. But let me just kind of come back to the points you were mentioning about kind of risk and vulnerability, and see if I can maybe give you some kind of answer to that. I suppose the government has a particular approach in which it presents the people in prison as the worst of the worst, the baddest of the baddest, the most dangerous people that we potentially face in our society. And if we accept that taken for granted assumption, then of course it leads us to kind of focus on risk, because we then start to think, well, my goodness me, all these people in prison are really dangerous. And of course, we don't want putting dangerous people back on the streets, because they could be a high risk to many, many other people. The way to address the risk issue, and of course this isn't done in the media, and it isn't done by politicians, but it is done by those of us who are critical of prisons, and those of us who actually try and get a greater understanding of what's actually going on. Because the truth is that we send a particular group of people to prison who've perpetrated a particular kind of crime, or a particular kind of crimes. Historically, the prison has always been directed against poor people, and it was largely, in the first instance, directed against people who had undertaken property offences. So the prison was, in effect, devised to control people who were a threat and a danger to property. Now, as time has gone on, and certainly in the last 30 odd years, the notions of risk and danger have shifted somewhat away from property, although that of course remains very, very important, and have also started to shift to issues around violence, and in particular violence against women and children, but also violence against other people. So you have this kind of this kind of dualistic kind of approach, which is saying danger and risk is really talking about people who've perpetrated property offences and hence a risk to the capitalist class, if we're going to be brutally honest about it. But also then this notion of, to a lesser extent, around violence. Now, how do we respond just to that notion around violence? Well, first of all, we look at the statistics in terms of the kind of the people who are in prison for which offences. Approximately 40% of the prison population have been involved in some kind of violent offence. So that immediately kind of says to us that somewhere in the region of 60%, or approximately 2/3 of the prison population, are not in prison for violent offences. So if one was to immediately look to actually reduce kind of prison population, you would look for the people who are currently serving sentences which have not got a kind of violent element, which, as it turns out, is, you know, it's 2/3 of the 83,000 population, which is somewhere, it's more than 40,000 people, right? So it's within the 20,000 people that are being kind of indicated by various different groups that should be released as soon as possible. The second thing to consider, and this is actually where it all gets really, really complicated, is that people who are sent to prison will often have done not just one particular crime, but have perpetrated a number of different crimes across their life course. So you have people who might be initially kind of imprisoned for say, a drug offence or for a property offence, who by the time they're in prison for the third or fourth time will have been involved in a violent offence. So there'll be people in prison who've perpetrated a number of different offences. And so it's really, really difficult to kind of to attract that label of these people are inherently violent. And this is what our prisons are there to deal with, is deal with people who perpetrate violence. Because it could be that this particular offence, they're in prison for violence, but they could previously have been in prison for something very, very different. And if you take a longer kind of view on it, it becomes quite interesting and to kind of to engage with that, because it becomes a lot less clear about what prisons are for. And indeed, one of the arguments is that if violence is happening after people have actually been imprisoned, or people are getting imprisoned for violent offences after they've already been imprisoned previously, is there not a strong argument that prisons are actually generating violence? Is there not an argument, by the longer you keep people in prison, the more violent they're actually likely to become? So there's the kind of, the point would be is that you have this superficial and straightforward argument, we can't release violent prisoners. But the truth is that actually we can't look at the data with any kind of accuracy in terms of violence, and nor can we assume that prisons are going to actually generate safety in the long term. But actually releasing people, even if they have been involved with violent offences, might actually not be, in the long term, that damaging for society. Further, and let me just kind of put two other additional kind of factors into the mix here, because these are important. Further, you have people in prison who are unlikely to offend again in terms of violence. And these are actually the people who perpetrated some of the most violent offences, and I mean by this intentional homicide. The people who are least likely to actually perpetrate the same offence again are people who've been convicted of murder or manslaughter. Now, there's various different reasons why that could be the case. It could be because they spend such a long time in prison that they lose 20 odd years of their life, and therefore that could be kind of something which is to deal with this. But also it could be that murder is context specific. So people are involved in various different forms of crimes, of violence, the most difficult to sometimes to grapple with, maybe people who would never do it again. And that's why some people talk about kind of someone who's murdered, but wouldn't necessarily put them in the category of murderer. And then finally, on this particular point, we have the even bigger kind of issue, which is, of course, that prisons do not contain all of the people who are most dangerous and harmful to us. Now, in the current COVID-19 crisis, we're hearing a lot of talk about problems around domestic violence and sexual violence within the home because women and children have suddenly become trapped with abusers. Now, the vast majority of people who engage in domestic violence are never imprisoned. The vast majority of people and men who rape are never imprisoned. So we have, with the rape situation, you have somewhere, and I haven't got the exact data right in front of me, but the attrition rate is appalling, where you have only a small number of percentage of people who actually perpetrate rape ending up in prison. And domestic violence is very, very similar. You have literally over 1 million incidents reported of domestic violence every single year, and yet that boils down to only a certain number of tens of thousands of actual criminal prosecutions, and from that, even smaller number of people who end up getting a prison sentence. And then you put the mix around the notion of harms of the powerful, and you look at the deaths that are generated through corporations and through the kind of lack of health and safety. You look at the issues around, just for the classic example now, Grenfell or Hillsborough, where people have died. You look at the deaths that are generated by police, and we do have police serial killers. That is police who've killed the members of the community more than once. These people never get prosecuted. We haven't had a successful prosecution of a police officer, despite hundreds of deaths by police officers since the 1960s, since 1969. And in that case, it wasn't even a prosecution for intentional homicide. It was a lesser offence, and the police officers served only a few months in prison. So when you start talking about this notion of violence within prison, when you start thinking about this notion of risk and violence, I know it's a very long answer, but quite frankly, it's a lot more complicated and difficult to kind of come to this simple equation of risk and release, as what the government and Robert Buckland are kind of indicating right now.
Thank you very much, David. I know we've got a couple more people that want to answer. I think we've got Eddie and we've got Paul, so we'll take them both together if that's okay. Eddie, do you want to go ahead and start?
Yeah, I agree with David. I think we do need a more, a prison system that is based on socialism. I'd prefer it to be outside prisons first, and then we can move into prisons, and we have to accept that. And I think that people do expect people to go to prison, irrespective of how that system's heavily weighted against poor people. I'd like you to focus on two things, really. You talked about mother and baby units. How do women and their children get into those? Who are excluded from those? And when do they stop being able to be with the mother being with their child, and the child being with their mother while in the prison system? And the other one is, how limited does legal aid become to prisoners to seek an appeal? And also, how difficult has now when you go for early release through since the last spate of reoffenders within so-called terrorist activities? How is that blocking people from getting early release from prison? Parole from prisons.
Cheers, and then we'll take Paul's question as well, and if you could answer them together, that'd be great. David, Paul, are you okay to just unmute yourself?
Yeah, it was just to David a question about Norway, because we'd heard that the prison system in Norway, possibly the Scandinavian countries, is relatively progressive. Do you think it would begin to meet some of the criteria that you put forward about dignity and so on? That's it. Thanks.
You okay to answer those, David?
Yeah, okay, so if I do forget anything, Paul or Ed, just kind of come back and remind me, because there's about 3 or 4 questions there, and I'll try and kind of address all of them. First of all, mother and baby units. So mother and baby units are basically, you get women in prison who are pregnant, and they will give birth whilst either on remand or kind of within the prison. And we have these kind of horrible stories of women giving birth whilst they're kind of handcuffed to a bed in a hospital, or they're giving birth within prisons and haven't got the appropriate kind of care and support. So basically, it's for women who either have children whilst in prison, or ultimately kind of prosecuted and imprisoned with very, very young babies. Now, the mother and baby unit, if I remember correctly, goes up to about 18 months, and then the baby's taken away. And there's all sorts of arguments for and against mother and baby units. One of the kind of arguments for is that it's good for the baby to be with their mother. The downside is actually the prison environment is not very stimulating, and there's arguments that it really impacts on the baby's development. So for this 18-month period, it's a real problem. Now, there's about 4,000 women in prison at any one time. The vast majority have done relatively minor offences. The clear point about women in prison, and this has been made again and again and again, is that if you look at the amount of women who've been involved in crimes of violence or murder, you're talking a couple of hundred, not 4,000 odd. The vast majority of women in the mother and baby units are women who basically have, kind of perpetrated relatively minor offences, generally relatively minor property and drug offences. Really, they shouldn't be in prison. And the kind of, there's very few women. There's a very plausible case for imprisoning, and that's been argued now for decades now that women would be one of the first people to be released if you want to kind of reduce the kind of penal state. So we had the situation the last couple of days where a woman died in Lord Newton prison in County Durham. We just, and I mentioned earlier, they've released 69 women who are either pregnant or kind of in the mother and baby units. The mother and baby units are not very big, by the way, and they can only house a sort of small number of women. I haven't got the numbers, but again, we're talking about hundreds across the penal estate in England and Wales. So we really do not have a very strong provision for mother and baby units. Mother and baby units are potentially dangerous to children. They may be even more painful for parents because the mother is kind of really concerned about the prison environment. And actually the person who's probably in prison at that time has often done a relatively minor offence. And you could argue that there's all sorts of things going on about why we sentence women to prison. And it's often because they deviate from conventional feminine norms. And that's often the reason why they're in prison, not because of the offence, which if it had been a man who'd done it, may not necessarily have led to a prison sentence. So there's all sorts of complexity there. But I would be arguing that, yes, of course, women should be with their children, but just not in a prison. The kind of situation about parole and the kind of broader notions around terrorism, well, yes, I mean, the whole kind of London Bridge incidents was kind of incredibly worrying. It led to a ratcheting up of the kind of sense of kind of severity and punishment within the kind of, and again, the notion of risk within the parole board hearings and so on and so forth. The truth is, a lot of it, and the recent legislation is really rhetorical because they really couldn't get too much more tougher than what they already were in terms of the control of and regulation of people involved in terrorist offences. I mentioned earlier that someone from Belmarsh Prison had been one of the prisoners who died in recent days. Well, Belmarsh Prison is also the prison that houses people, and so it's a high security prison, and it houses people who are held there for kind of detained under various different counter-terrorist and anti-terrorist legislation. It's kind of the iron coffins. They are incredibly repressive, high security regimes. They're profoundly damaging to people. They do not lead to a de-radicalisation. We've known through the history of prisons that people who are in prison are incredibly susceptible to ideologies, particularly religious ideologies. The very prison, when it was founded back in the 1810s in England and the United States, the penitentiaries were all about religious conversion. They were all about trying to kind of get people, because they recognize that people within prison are vulnerable. Ironically enough, they are vulnerable to ideologies. It's always been part of the prison that people have been vulnerable to ideologies. why would it be any different in terms of not just a Christian kind of ideological input, but a radical Islamic ideological input within a prison place? Prisons are actually hotbeds, not for controlling counterterrorism, but actually about kind of generating kind of and radicalizing prisoners. And so you had also, just after the case on London Bridge, you had people like John Crilly, who very bravely was an ex-prisoner, and also somebody who was prosecuted under the joint enterprise laws, which means he hadn't actually done anything. He simply was aware that the offence was taking place. And we could go into joint enterprise at a later date, because that's another kind of element about murder, where we have lots of people who are convicted of murder who haven't actually murdered anybody. And of course, we could start talking about releasing people from joint enterprise, because quite frankly, they haven't done anything, and they might be serving 15, 20 years in prison or life sentence. And this can include people as young as 13-year-olds. It's just, with our criminal justice system, is a total fiasco and joke when it comes to this notion of justice. It's very criminalizing, and it's very punishment, and it's barely a system, but it absolutely does not deliver justice. That takes me to the point from Paul, if I may, about the Norwegian and Nordic kind of countries, or Scandinavian countries. And of course, this takes us from all the way across from Iceland to Finland. And you mentioned the Norwegian situation. Perhaps you're thinking there of Bastøy Island prison, which is often touted to it as the kind of most humane prison in the world, because it has no kind of walls. So it's an island where people kind of go and kind of are placed on as a kind of prison without without very high security. Now, Paul's kind of pointed, is this kind of going to address this in terms of a socialist kind of response? Well, it is important to recognise that the Nordic countries are based on social democratic political economy, and we are based on neoliberal political economy. And those countries which have a neoliberal political economy are much more punitive and are much more harsh in terms of their prison regimes. And those nations, with perhaps the exception of Cuba, which have a kind of socialist kind of orientation, or at least a social democratic orientation, are generally much more lenient. And I would kind of accept there is kind of some arguments to be made about places like Bastøy Island. But let me just throw a few other things into the mix here, which actually complicate the kind of situation in Norway and elsewhere. First of all, Bastøy Island and other progressive prisons are for Norwegians only. People who are migrants get prisons very similar to the United Kingdom. So there's a big kind of issue in the context there about who these prisons are for, because whilst there's a very strong sense of social inclusion within Nordic countries about their own citizens, they are terrible when it comes to punishing migrants and others. So there's a certain boundary already placed around Bastøy Island and others. Secondly, there's been a problem in Nordic countries about disproportionate numbers of deaths in custody and self-inflicted deaths. I've already mentioned that in terms of the prison populations are much smaller in places like Norway and Sweden and Finland and so on and so forth. But they have had, and this is what the kind of Nordic criminologists and critical socialists who are looking at prisons in those countries have pointed to, is that actually there's still something going very wrong. They've also had problems with pre-trial detention in places like Denmark. There is no panacea here with the Nordic countries. They have their own unique difficulties and kind of problems. And then finally, the assumption that a prison, because it doesn't have the same kind of problems regarding conditions, like we've heard from in terms of the Independent Monitoring Board, or we've heard from in terms of the Her Majesty's Chief Inspector of Prisons, regarding places like Coldingley or HMP Pentonville or Stockton or so on and so forth. Prison walls and prison bars do not make a prison. Prison is about estrangement, exclusion, separation, and the pains of imprisonment. The real pains of imprisonment are not just manifested within the dirt and the rats and the insects. They are manifested within the very notion of estrangement and the separation from family. So what you find is the research that's been done on Bastøy Island, the best prison in the world. You have lots of unhappy prisoners who find it incredibly painful. And in fact, they sometimes find it more painful because there isn't the walls and bars there. And that's the same finding that we get in what we know as open prisons or category D prisons in England and Wales, because there's different categories of prisoner and different kinds of prisons. And you have from Cat A, high security prisons, to local prisons, which are Cat B, which take the people from the courts, to Cat C prisons, which are training prisons, which, although those being closed prisons and what we would imagine being prisons, to open prisons, which is where people can leave and kind of go on day release for work. And you often find that people don't like open prisons either, because actually they're still in prison. And the prison is not just about physical conditions or health issues. Prisons are about the loss of time and the loss of positive time and the waste of time. And that is the same in Bastoy as it is in every single prison the world over.
Okay, thank you very much, David. Does anybody else want to come in with any questions or comments? No? Okay. Yeah, David, thank you very much for tonight. Really grateful as well for you to rescheduling from our original meeting, which we unfortunately had to cancel. We'll wrap it up there. But I think as well, I mean, based on some of what you mentioned, it might be great to get you back once all this is over and to hear something more detailed about prisons in general. But thank you once again. Very grateful for you to doing this tonight, and hopefully see you all again soon. Thanks everyone for coming on as well.
Thank you very much, Chris.